Hi, everyone, and welcome to Values Aligned Philanthropy Foundation's Resisting Hate and Extremism.
Thanks so much, Kenny. Well, there has been growing concern in the philanthropic sector about funding hate and extremism. And I think a lot of foundations are just looking for some guidance. How do you identify hate groups? How do you handle requests from donors when those requests don't align with your values? How can you proactively develop policies to address this issue before a crisis hits? So the Council on Foundations launched the Values Aligned Philanthropy Project in late 2020 to try to address some of these questions. And the first phase of the work was involved working with our consultant, Roe Thorpe, to do a landscape scan. You know, who is doing great work, what's being done, and to put together some case studies, as well as a resource hub that we put together on our website with best practices and some other materials to try to be helpful to foundations. And we also just published a blog post in the last day by Eric Jolly, the head of the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, on their organizational journey with these issues. And links to all of these resources are in the chat. So the council wants to try to be a good partner with those who are doing great work and also provide some assistance to those who are newer to these issues. So let me introduce our speakers. We have some really fantastic speakers. Roe Thorpe's our moderator. She's an independent consultant who has more than 30 years of experience as an organizational leader and elected official. We're also going to be hearing from some of the organizations that Roe interviewed for the report. So real leaders on both hate funding and values aligned grant making. So we have Abbas Barzegar, the director of the Horizon Forum at the Proteus Fund, Anna Fink, who's the executive director of the Amalgamated Foundation, Winter Kinney, who's the vice president of development at the Community Foundation of the Ozarks, Zack Huffman, the director of the Courageous Collaborations Initiative at Stand Together. And I also just want to thank Nidal Zuhir, who did a great job in putting this together from our team, and our wonderful program team who's doing all the behind the scenes work here. So these panelists are going to highlight, the idea really is how do you create policies that are going to help liberal foundations, conservative foundations, and everybody in between to just make sure that your work is aligning with your values and avoid making grants to extremist or violent organizations. So throughout the discussion, if you have any questions at all for the panelists, please put it in the Q&A box, and I'm going to turn it over to Roe for the discussion.
Thanks, David. I was so happy to work on this report for the council. The team has been a total joy to work with, and it was really wonderful to be able to talk to so many foundation leaders and advocates. And I'm happy to be here today to talk about what I learned. I apologize for the glare on my glasses. I just want to tell you I'm in Portland, Oregon, and there's like a weird Pacific Northwest light that's happening now, and it is what it is. But anyway, I am going to give you a very brief overview of the Values Aligned Philanthropy report and what I learned and what the report recommends. I'm going to start with what I learned, and please know that in the full report and on the resource hub, there is a lot more information. There are great places to go to really dig in on these issues. So the report describes the problem of funding of hate and extremism. And what it does is review philanthropy's response so far, and it offers recommendations for foundations who want to take action. It includes case studies of 4 different foundations and what they've done, just so you can get a deeper idea of individual foundation responses. The report is based on interviews. I know many people who are in the audience for this call were people I interviewed. Certainly everyone else on the panel are people that I interviewed for the report. And we talked really broadly with foundations, PSOs, advocates, talking about what was needed and what they'd recommend. And then I also read news accounts and reports and all kinds of other written materials, and also the policies that people shared with me that are currently in use. So before I tell you what I learned, I just want to say a couple words about terminology here because it's a question that comes up a lot. So in this report, hate, the word hate refers to speech or action that targets a specific group of people based on their personal characteristics or association with a group. Organizations that promote hate may or may not directly incite violence. And this is something that is a place where a lot of foundations draw a very clear line. But for the purpose of this report, they may or may not directly incite violence, but regardless of whether they do or not, their efforts are destabilizing and affect the actual and perceived safety of their targets. And then extremism borrows from the Anti-Defamation League definition, which is existing substantially outside of belief systems that are more broadly accepted in society. Extremism and hate can and do cross the political spectrum, and they're not affiliated with any one party or platform. However, reflecting the moment that we're in, the report most often refers to anti-democracy organizations that are often connected with the far right and with white supremacy. So, so that's the moment that it refers to. And then I want to talk just a little bit about what the report says, what the high points are, and you certainly can read those. But first of all, it's really clear that the funding of hate groups is a serious issue and not something that is not having a direct effect on society. The FBI has documented a dramatic rise in incidents involving hate and extremism in the US over the past several years. Some of the incidents involve violence and others threaten to undermine democratic systems. Journalists and advocacy groups have traced the funding for these groups to some mainstream sources that include foundations. And, you know, although foundations, this funding of hate and extremism certainly is only a small percentage, a tiny drop of overall foundation giving in this country, there still have been calls for both inside and outside the philanthropic sector for action on this. And what I learned is that this is an issue that's on a lot of people's minds. You know, I think no one wants to be in the position of waking up to a news story that accuses them of hate funding, or finding out that in spite of all their work to be more inclusive and more representative of the community, that they're funding a hate group. Many foundations have created policies to make sure that they're taking a stand against hate funding, and certainly this paper advocates for that. But others are sort of in the process, or they want to do it, but they don't quite know where to start. And the sector itself has responded to concerns about hate funding in a lot of different ways, not just policies, and you'll hear about some of those today. But just about everyone agrees that there's more to do, and foundations are looking for guidance and they're looking for resources to support them in those efforts. The two biggest resources that the people I interviewed said that they need are model policies to use that others are using, and you know that they can adapt to their own needs. And people really wanted information that they could turn to when it comes to making a decision about whether a group is a hate group. And so here is where I want to talk a little bit about the recommendations that I made in the report. So the most important recommendation from which, and this is the one that from which all the others flow, is that foundations should work to create policies to prevent hate funding and get them in place as soon as possible. Now, that's easy for me to say, right? Some people, and just about everyone I talked to who didn't currently have a policy in place, wished for a boilerplate policy that could be, you know, adopted by everyone. It could be the standard. But it really is not that simple, because foundations yourselves, those of you who are listening, are so different from one another. The policy that you have needs to reflect the values of your foundation and your mission and goals. Some foundations have added a clause to their due diligence policy. Some have written separate policies entirely. Some have added a non-discrimination policy requirement for all their grantees. Others are going further because they've done a lot of work about inclusion and community representation, and they're thinking not only about hate, but about harm to communities, and ending their funding, not just for hate groups, but for any entities that in their judgment cause harm to the communities they serve. Many foundations have signed on to the Amalgamated campaign that you'll hear about today, and I certainly encourage you to do that. There are a lot of different ways to approach this, and the key is finding what fits for your foundation. You should also consider including not just the funds you're giving away, but also the funds you're accepting, because publicizing gifts and sponsorships can give credibility to groups that are looking for it. And a lot of groups are looking for that kind of mainstream stamp of approval, and you don't want to be used for that if the group does not align with your values. The resource hub that's associated with this report offers links to a lot of model policies the foundations can draw from, and I'd invite all of you in the audience to check it out. And also, if you want to share your policies, to share them with Nidal or with me, to send them to us if you'd like to be included, and we certainly can take a look at them and add them. What the foundations I talked to who had policies talked about being the most helpful was just seeing a bunch of different things and sort of drawing pieces and structures from what they were seeing, kind of making their own, but from pieces that already existed. In order to work, the policy needs to have a procedure attached to it. So when questions arise, how will you answer them? What is the source of information that you're going to use to answer these questions? What's your process? Who's responsible for making that decision? Knowing that going into it is a big help. Many organizations use the Southern Poverty Law Center list of hate groups, which is a great resource, but others found that they needed additional resources, and there were cases where they didn't agree with who was on the Southern Poverty Law Center list. Complications can also arise when communities have conflicting values, especially around polarizing issues. That's why we call this project Values Aligned Philanthropy, because in order to work, your foundation's values must be at the core of your policy. And in addition to the Values Aligned Philanthropy Resource Hub, our panelist from the Horizon Forum has helpful resources to share about this as well. And he'll talk about this in a little bit. Greater Giving also has a helpful decision-making guide that they offer on their website. There's a link to that on the Resource Hub as well, that can take you through making all kinds of tricky decisions, values-related decisions, in addition to this one. So each foundation also needs to answer the question of how you will be communicating your policy and with whom you will be communicating it. It's not easy to bring all the stakeholders in the organization along. This issue is different for different types of foundations, and there are specific issues about donor advised funds and how to balance DAF holders' expectations with foundation's values, your foundation's values. Although it might sound daunting, all of this and all these considerations, I do want to tell you that I heard story after story about how this was not as bad as people had initially feared, and that doing it before a problem arises is so much better than scrambling once a problem does arise. You don't want to be putting a policy in place in the midst of a crisis. So there's obviously a lot more to say about this subject, but I'm going to leave it here because I know you'll get a lot from hearing from our panelists, and they have a lot to say about their experiences. So I'm also happy to answer questions during Q&A or by email afterward. Feel free to get in touch. So with that, I just want to introduce our panelists one more time. Winter Kinney from the Community Foundation of the Ozarks, Anna Fink from Amalgamated Foundation, Zack Huffman from Courageous Collaborations Initiative at Stand Together, and Abbas Barzegar from the Horizon Forum at the Proteus Fund. So I think what I'm going to do is just dive right in with our panelists and start asking you all some questions. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us all today. So first of all, this is a question for Abbas and Zack. Has the current political moment created a need for philanthropy to address issues of hate and extremism, in your opinion? And if so, how? And I'd say, and if not, why not? So Zack, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And just want to say thanks to everyone for joining today, and really appreciate the Council on Foundations having me here. It's great to be with you all. And so the short answer to your question is yes. I think absolutely the political moment has created the need for philanthropy to address these issues. I think we're all seeing and feeling the impact of a United States that doesn't feel all that united at the moment. And whether we're scrolling through our social media feeds, tuning into the news, we're seeing I think the political and social manifestations of this issue, everywhere. And so, whether that's political dysfunction in DC, whether that's, extreme voices saying things that are hate-filled, or whether that's, even at the worst, instances of political violence in our communities, there's definitely a lot to tackle. And so I think one thing, though, that is important to keep in mind is that I would argue that what we're seeing is actually a manifestation of a lot of deeper and more complex issues at hand, and trends that have been, underlying our social fabric for a while, whether that's, the decades-long decline in social and institutional trust, rising affective polarization, the average citizen's, declining number of close and meaningful relationships. When you combine those sorts of, trends with, voices on the fringe, of either, side or spectrum, that are trying to either knowingly or unknowingly, stoke that extremism, and further divide us on issues where we already have a lot of work to do, whether that's racial justice, religious intolerance, immigration. You're setting up a scenario for toxic division to start running rampant, and I think that's what we've seen. So, but it's not all bad news. I think that one thing to keep in mind is that there's really an exhaustive majority out there in this country, and I'm assuming that all of us on this call are probably within that exhaustive majority that don't want to see this, be the path for the United States and the future of our country. And so the question is, how do we, work with folks within that exhaustive majority to try and bridge divides in our communities? And one group that I did want to call out that's done a lot of great work on identifying the exhaustive majority, who they are, sort of the contours of that slice of the American public. It's a group called More in Common. I'd encourage you to check them out. Specifically, their 2018 Hidden Tribes study has done a lot of great work on this. But at Stand Together and the Courageous Collaborations Initiative specifically, that's what we're all about, is trying to work with what we call social entrepreneurs that are within that exhaustive majority, and giving them the tools, the resources, the framework, and the funding that they need to bridge divides. That can look like anyone from a pastor speaking to his or her congregation about toxic polarization. That can look like a mayor protecting protesters in her community and keeping them safe from police violence, or it can look like a teacher in a K-12 classroom leading students through a story exchange. And this is just a few examples of the people that we have the privilege of working with through our partners with Courageous Collaborations. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but want to pass it over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. Abbas?
No, thank you, Rory, and thank you to the Council, of course, and really, it's really encouraging not just to have this conversation, but the fact that the Council took this work up, and I'm pleased to be here with my coach and mentor through this process, Anna Fink, who's been a great partner for years. Thank you, Anna. So Zack, I'm so happy that you brought up these sort of deeper issues, because I think that people want a simple and quick solution to this, and at least recognizing that, we're sitting on the front lines of a much deeper problem, complex problem. And the question comes down to, how is it that each one of our roles, each of us in each one of our sectors can take on this whole of society problem? And I hate to use DC jargon here, but the truth is that for the better part of maybe a decade or more, we've been talking about problems around extremism, violent extremism, polarization, social cohesion, pro-social, this or that. And so government's taken a role on this, education's tried to talk about this. And so at the Horizon Forum, we're really looking at how different sectors have approached this problem. And now we look and we land at philanthropy and we say, what role does philanthropy have in dealing with this issue? And obviously supporting organizations on the right side of this issue in terms of de-escalation and conflict resolution, supporting some of those organizations is the right thing to do. But philanthropy itself, I think, needs to recognize itself as a civil society partner, and probably one of the most important that we have in the country at the moment. And if we look at the other sectors, the stock market literally has just crashed or is close to suffering very seriously because tech has once again failed, right? So when you look at big tech and what they've done to exacerbate this problem, fail to address this problem, we know that we can't really rely upon the private sector to take this up. Government is limited by definition, and I don't think we want to live in a society where government takes this up. So when we think about civil society, who are the most influential players in civil society? It is philanthropy. And so philanthropy, to think about itself in this very deliberate way of a conflict resolution and conflict transformation partner that can de-escalate the political moment for us right now, not homogenize it, not play a partisan role, but de-escalate it and reduce the tension in our society. I think that is the real opportunity for us as we approach philanthropy with this issue.
Thank you. There's a lot to think about there. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask Winter and Anna, what is your organization's experience with values-aligned philanthropy, and what have you done in this to address these issues? Winter, you want to start us off?
Sure. And I'll just add my thanks to the council and Roe as well, particularly for being included, because for everyone listening or watching today, just to sort of give a little context, Community Foundation of the Ozarks is located in southern Missouri in the southwestern corner, headquartered on Springfield. We are a medium-sized community foundation managing assets of about $400 million. And we live in a very conservative part of the world. And so I feel like that sort of helps with the story when groups are like, how do we do this? How do we get started? What do we do? You kind of just have to do it in a weird way and rip the Band-Aid off, if that makes sense. But our president and CEO started talking about this 2 years ago in the fall of 2019. He'd read a bunch of the articles and there was a lot of news going on at that point about funding extremism and those kinds of things. And then he'd also been at a conference for community foundations where this had also come up as a topic. And so he brought it back to our board and our staff. We had a non-discrimination policy for our unrestricted grantee programs and for our scholarship funds for anyone applying for either of those grants. But what we didn't have was something associated with our donor advised funds, and we manage about 450 separate donor advised funds. So in fairly short order, we borrowed. We did some research and borrowed from several other community foundations and kind of meshed it together and put a policy together that works for our area and for our community foundation. I will say we call it viewpoint-based instead of values, because the word value was a little bit of a trigger for our board that certainly has people that are on all sides of the political spectrum. So that was just something that made a difference, and again, in our little corner of the world. So I thought I would highlight that. We rolled it out relatively quickly. So we started talking about it in October of 2019, and we had a policy passed by June of 2020. And don't forget, we also had a pandemic and a shutdown and work from home in the midst of all of that too. But it was also that important that we get it, because we needed to have a policy before anything large happened. And there's a secondary question that's coming where I will answer kind of a donor, tell a donor story there. I don't want to take up too much time here, but I will say that it has been less of a thing than I think a lot of us thought it would be. And certainly it's in all of our information. When we meet with someone who's going to set up a donor advised fund, part of the conversation now And so I just say that maybe as a point of encouragement for others if you don't have a policy, that I have been pleasantly surprised about how well it has gone over.
Great, thank you. Anna, can you tell us about the experience of Amalgamated, which is really fantastic and forward-thinking?
Yeah, definitely, and really glad to be here with all of you. And thank you, Roy, for all of your work on this report, and to the council for putting this fantastic panel together today. Amalgamated Foundation is a little bit of a unique institution where the foundation partnered to Amalgamated Bank, which was founded almost 100 years ago by immigrant workers in the sweatshops of New York at the turn of the century, who came together and used their collective voice and collective power to change the work conditions and create better health and safety conditions for workers in the sweatshops, and then went on to form the Amalgamated Bank and invest in their own communities and families in many different ways. And so that's the legacy that the Amalgamated Foundation stands on today. And when we started the foundation about 3 years ago, we really wanted to build a platform that would lead with our values and our perspective to meet the challenges of the moment, knowing that we felt there was a need to reinvent the way philanthropy operates, to break down silos, to question power dynamics, and really to reshape some practices that we saw as archaic at the time. And we've really started to see that, particularly around this issue, in relationship to the intersecting crises that we're facing: climate change, racial injustice, wealth and income inequality, all sort of exacerbated with the COVID pandemic, and the attacks on democracy and fundamental human rights in this moment. So we really sort of see our work on the issue of hate as a bright line and an opportunity to take bold action to challenge hate as something that kind of cuts across all of these different issues as a basic value. We similarly, I'll just talk a little bit about the policy we put in place, and then talk a little bit more about our collective campaign and call to action a little later on here. But we, in 2019, similarly, were reading the reports and the data coming out about donations to hate groups from donor-advised funds. So we put into place immediately a policy, an explicit policy, drawing from a variety of sources, including organizations in the field who were working on similar issues with social media platforms, with consulting with legal counsel, as well as other foundations. And so we put into place our own policy. We shared that publicly, and we worked with our technology partner to implement a hate screen as part of that, and then encouraged others to do the same, and have been pretty open source about sharing that work, that language, and again, sort of building toward a collective campaign and a collective voice in this space that I'll talk more about in a minute.
Thank you. Well, Winter, I think we want to give you a chance to tell us your story about, about what the feedback was that you got from donors.
Sure. In the midst of creating the policy, we had a new donor advised fund set up at the end of the year in 2019. And a couple of that donors' grant requests actually ended up being to two organizations that were on the Southern Poverty Law Center list. And this is the first time in our 47-year history that we had anything that had risen to that. We did not feel like we could go back to her at that point and tell her that she couldn't make those grants, because we did not have a policy yet in place. So hence the reason that we moved pretty quickly through board governance to be able to make that happen. And so again, by late spring of 2020, we did have to say to her, which our board voted. So that's our policy, is that staff flags it and does the research, and then we take it to our executive committee and our board to say, you know, yay or nay on whether or not we're allowing these grant requests to move forward. And our board did vote that we were no longer going to honor those any future grant requests to those agencies. She didn't have a long history with us. I mean, she was a brand new donor advisor. Her financial advisor had recommended that she set up a fund here. He's a former board member of ours. But quite honestly, she took it better than expected. Our president and CEO did call her and had the conversation, then followed up with a letter. We also talked to her financial advisor. We did not want him to be blindsided by something that we had changed, you know, sort of mid donor advised fund. She still has a donor advised fund here. She still does grants, not to those organizations. I'm still unclear if she really knew what those organizations were funding, because as many of you know, they are sort of, you've got to dig kind of deep, and their names don't sound like what is actually happening. So, you know, she'll never admit that to us, to be honest, if she did or didn't know, and that's okay. But so we've retained that, and then we have continued to have this conversation with folks as they're establishing donor advised funds. And again, it's been a lot less of an issue than I suspected that it might be, particularly living in the part of the world that we live in. I will say that the biggest question has been surrounding women's and abortion rights. If we were going to consider that as something that we were not going to fund through donor advised. And it doesn't matter which side of that you fall on. I've had the questions from both sides of donors, and we are not taking that up as part of our viewpoint-based policy, at least at this point, moving forward. So, but that has been the biggest question that donors ask so far. So hopefully that's helpful. I know we'll probably say this again, but anyone is welcome to email me or reach out if there's any way, steal our policy, any bit or part of it that you would like. We're all in this together. So you know, I'm just happy to help in any way.
Thank you. So now I think we want to give a chance for Anna and Zack to describe your campaigns and programs that you've been working on. Anna, you want to go first and tell us about Amalgamated's campaign?
Sure, yeah. Excuse me. As I mentioned, we really started leaning into this issue in a significant way in 2019. We launched a campaign that we called Hate is Not Charitable, along with our work to implement a policy and a screen. We, based on our values, felt it was really important not just to sort of do that quietly, but to do that publicly and to invite others to join us in collective action around this issue. And so we launched a pledge and an invitation to other DAF providers, other philanthropic institutions, as well as individual donors to join us in pledging to not give to hate, excuse me, and to implement their own policies and processes along the same lines. And to be honest, we sort of did this sent an email to a small group of colleagues and didn't know what to expect. And the campaign has really exceeded any expectations that we might have had, gaining support from more than 100 institutions representing billions of dollars in assets, and leading, I would say, to just a huge sort of groundswell of dialogue and conversation across philanthropy. We saw a real surge in interest and urgency around this after the events of January 6th really laid bare the real threats to our democracy that hate and specifically white nationalism pose, and have continued to support this work through partnership with the Horizon Forum and Abbas's leadership. And the Horizon Forum continues to kind of take this work and hone the screen and the tools and resources available to share with other institutions. And we really see this campaign and this work as tied to our broader mission as a platform leading with values to meet the challenges of the moment. We see the hate screen and the development and sort of refining of the hate screen that the Horizon Forum has taken on as real ways to leverage technology and systems of philanthropy for social justice outcomes. We've, in addition, sort of as next steps coming out of this work, we launched a call engaging with corporate partners about our roles and responsibilities on the issues of hate and our role in rebuilding a multiracial democracy through the creation of a democracy reinvestment fund. We're also doing other things like turning our lens to how disaster funding is distributed, bringing together trusted community organizations in advance of climate disasters to be able to spring into action for immediate relief and also the long haul of rebuilding and recovery. So we really are looking at ways sort of the tools and strategies as well as the issue intersections with hate kind of bridge across a broad range of values and approaches and opportunities that we see for philanthropy to be a real leader in civil society.
Awesome. And then Zack, do you want to tell us a little bit about Stand Together's Courageous Conversations program and the other work you're doing?
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to. Really where Courageous Collaborations, lands for a, oh yeah, no worries. It's a lot of alliteration. We love that. Where it really resides for us is it's both a commitment to one of our first principles, which is uniting with anyone to do right and no one to do wrong, but then also asking the question of how we can use philanthropic resources and provide tools and other sorts of support to organizations that are instrumental in really solving various pieces of the problem within this broader issue set. And so, what that has looked like in terms of how Courageous Collaborations came to be was, I'm sure that everyone remembers the unfortunate and deadly incidents that occurred in Charlottesville in 2017, where we had 19 people injured and one person killed by, white supremacists at that point in time in that event. And so at that point, we looked and we said, we really need a dedicated work stream of again, grants and partnerships that go to figure out how do we actually equip social entrepreneurs across sectors to bridge divides in their communities and hopefully prevent future incidents like this from happening and prevent the rise from going any higher. And so that Communities Overcoming Extremism project that we in this case is actually the Charles Koch Institute, joined alongside the Anti-Defamation League, the Ford Foundation, the Soros Charitable Foundation, the Fetzer Institute, and several other foundations and organizations to bring together those cross-sector leaders for national convenings, publish a report, a podcast series, and a whole list of tools and resources that communities to understand how they can really get to the root of these issues and set up systems that allow the communities to be more resilient to violence and bridge those divides in a peaceful way. And so I'd encourage you to check out the report and all the resources related to that project, and they're all linked in the white paper that Rowie and the council has put together. So I definitely encourage you to take a look. But what that's grown into today is our broader Courageous Collaborations initiative. And what it really is it's a three-part strategy to trying to basically help heal our nation's divisions by helping Americans recognize our shared humanity, embrace our differences, and solve the greatest challenges of our time together. And so the first step in that strategy is empowering academic research and key thought leaders that are publishing basically the latest and greatest in how you actually cure intolerance and really get at the root of it, whether that's research on social trust or affective polarization or any number of issues that are related to this broader issue area. We're trying to support them and make sure they have what they need to do that research. The second part is, the piece that I've mentioned a little bit already, which is empowering the social entrepreneurs who are closest to the problem of division in their communities to grow and expand their work and continue to help reach, key audiences that need help and support. And then the third piece is telling the story, the positive story of the collaborations that are actually happening across the country. I think too often, our narratives focus so much on the division and not enough on the areas where people are actually coming together across, racial, political, socioeconomic, religious divides to do many, many great things in their communities. And so we're hoping to also tell those stories.
Wonderful, thank you. I think, so I know that people have questions about how to get started with all of this. And Abbas, this is what Horizon Forum has really been supporting foundations in doing. Can you talk a little bit about, the resources you provide and how foundations can get started?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been a great privilege to work with foundations in this space, and very similar to what Zack just mentioned with the model of bringing cross-sector folks together. That's really at the heart of our work, is that we're just bringing together folks to talk in what we call focus group dialogues. And so they're dialogue-based focus groups where they're just very carefully curated conversations to identify best practices, constraint points, consensus points, and literally through that conversation with academic research and other kinds of work, identify a path forward and lay out that that blueprint, if you will. And so that's been the kind of real power of the process, because the tools that we've provided have actually been drawn from these convenings. So what we would call it, in academia, you say that we have peer review, a kind of peer review process. Well, this is a practitioner-based peer review process, and so it's very exciting because then we take those solutions and bring them back into the feedback loop so that foundations can make use of them. And so where can folks get started? I'm happy to report out that the good news is that everybody has already started in one way or the other. And what I mean by that is that every foundation has a due diligence process. Every foundation has a risk management process. Most foundations have within their HR systems, just like any other kind of organization in the United States, they have non-discrimination policies, right? And so the fact is that the infrastructure actually exists within organizations to simply tweak, add to, maneuver around existing governance strategies so that they can implement something. And they've already been through policies like this and other types of things. So adding a layer of a new policy, I don't believe is really that difficult. It takes some level of political will within the organization, between the board, the executive staff, et cetera, to identify the sort of urgency to do that and to move forward. The bad news is that philanthropy, one of the things that makes it strong is that it's so decentralized, right? And that every community foundation and every foundation has its own way of doing things. Well, that's a strength, but it's also one of the weaknesses, right? And so the weakness then becomes that there isn't a boilerplate. There isn't a sort of a trade association with a standard format that everybody can just copy and paste. And so what it does is it creates the need for us to create these kind of cohort-based peer learning environments and facilitate that conversation. And so literally the tools that we've provided are twofold. We have done some research and aggregated various resources to identify as broad as possible a group of problematic organizations that would be considered typically to be hate or extremist organizations. We've, very similar to the values aligned report, identified best practices and policies across the sector, and also drawn in examples from other sectors. And we've also given samples of what protocol might look like to implement that process. And so it's basically just a conversation that we have and a series of meetings that we have either with foundations and small groups working together to provide that peer learning space, or on a one-on-one basis to just work through them.
Wonderful, thank you. I think, so we have one more question that I was going to ask Abbas and Zack, but we have so many questions from the audience that we haven't started getting to that I do want to give an opportunity for those. So if it's okay with you two, I'm going to move to those questions. So one of the first questions is about, isn't this the job of the IRS to work on this? I'm going to tell you that there is a lot more discussion of that in the white paper that the council published, and I'm going to ask you to take a look at that, and I'm happy to give you more resources on that if you need them. I also, let's see, so Winter, there's a couple of questions for you. One is whether or not you can share your process on anti-LGBTQ plus organizations, especially as it relates to religious organizations and their policies, and whether or not that's something that you've addressed.
So the bad answer is going to be, I think it depends, because back to the white paper of there is no one-stop shop centralized policy, although I'm learning today and learned from the white paper too about Horizon Forum and some other places that we can go look at now that I didn't know existed, quite honestly, before this. So again, this is ever changing and we are always learning, I think, is also going to be part of what happens. But the requests that we denied from the donor advisor were LGBTQ plus that were not, they were likely religiously affiliated, but they were not a specific church, if that makes sense. So they were organizations at a national level working on things. At this point, we are not going to get into donors not being able to give to one church over another. That seems kind of dangerous to me, unless for some reason that church were to become particularly dangerous. So that's like a really terrible answer because it was so gray. But I think that's kind of like the weaving and how we have to take each one of these with its own research and then potentially to our board as that comes up. So I don't know if anybody else has advice. You all are dealing with this on a much more national level than I am.
Does anyone else want to chime in on this question? Abbas, you look like you
I
want
just want to echo something and report out from a case that we did an assessment on. And so Winter hit it right on the head there, that it's often the case that the really problematic anti-LGBTQ kind of groups that are out there, they don't necessarily operate directly out of the religious organization or the church, okay? But they have, let's say, a particular online presence or an organization that sometimes isn't, organizationally affiliated with the church at all, but they might share the pastor or share the leadership. And it really demands that you look at the language that this institution is using and you deem for yourself whether or not it's causing harm or the perception of harm to the community. And so that's actually not that hard to do. If somebody looks at the language, listens to a podcast, reads something, and it calls for divine wrath or something of this nature, this is harmful. And so you as a foundation have to decide whether or not you want to host that show, if you will, right? If you were a theater, if you were a public theater, would you put on any play? Would you put on any show? It's not just the case that you can sign off because the IRS has deemed it okay or a hands-off type of approach. You have to make the ethical decision. And so once you get down to that process and you identify how you're going to work through the gray areas, thank you, Winter. We actually have a section in our toolkit called gray areas. And so once you identify that process, it's actually not that hard, and I don't think it's as problematic as people imagine it to be.
I would agree. That was our experience, has been our experience.
Right.
Awesome. So let me ask this question, and this is one that was submitted in advance of this webinar, and it is, how do you recommend synthesizing or compartmentalizing the difference between a hate group grant-making policy and an organization's non-discrimination policy. Does anyone have any experience or advice about that? Anna, it strikes me that you might. Not to put you on the spot.
Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. I'm actually, I'll say something briefly, but I think Abbas may have more to say on this. I mean, I think it actually depends on the institution. Some foundations who we've talked to, and many have sort of called me and had closed door, quiet conversations, you know, in addition to conversations that have been more public around the Hate Is Not Charitable campaign. But it really depends. If an organization already has a really good non-discrimination policy in place, this is often something that they can really sort of lean on that to develop their grant-making policy around hate. In other cases, it's been more, you know, to Abbas's point, within a due diligence and risk management framework, but there's no right answer on that. I think it creates a real opportunity, and certainly a opportunity to think about consistency across an institution.
I could add to it, but I want to step back for a second in case Zach or Winter want to jump in on that one. Okay, I'll just say quickly that many of the community foundations that we talk to for their direct giving programs include, I think, and you've highlighted this, Rory, they include a non-discrimination policy sort of in the grant agreement, right? So they kind of have to, the grantee has to sign a declaration on that. So the conversation now is, if that exists in your direct giving, would you move that requirement over to your fund agreement with your DAT, with your donor advisor, right? So the fund agreement itself, does it include a non-discrimination policy? Would you put an anti-hate policy within that fund agreement? And that is a question where, you know, community foundations are they just wrestle with inside their, you know, inside their governance, you know, governance committees and whatnot. But as far as compartmentalizing and thinking through it, just, you know, you've already got a non-discrimination law in your HR policies, right? It probably exists somewhere in your grantee program. Now, do you carry it over to your DAF? And then how does your anti-hate work just follow, again, to echo Anna's point about consistency, just layer on top of that?
Thank you. There was a pre-question that asked if anyone had built policies and practices around limiting or declining grant making to law enforcement, given the historical and deeply embedded institutional racism and disproportionate harm on our BIPOC communities. And I will answer that and say yes. And there are examples of those policies in the resource hub that you can see. And that has been, for some foundations that are in progressive areas or where they've done some pretty deep inclusion work and it reflects their organization's mission, they have gone in that direction, and I'd be happy to give you some direct referrals if you want to talk to someone from those foundations, but that definitely is something that is happening. Zack, this is a question for you. Let's see, it says, Zack mentioned that the initiative was sparked by Charlottesville. Is CCI explicitly addressing white supremacy and nationalism in its work?
Yeah, so the Courageous Collaborations Initiative, I would say the most direct way that we address that is through our anti-political violence work. So you can go to our partners like the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton, Project Over Zero, the Anti-Defamation League. Those are some really great places to start to kind of see where we've directly addressed the risk of political violence within communities. And, you know, as you noted at the beginning, Rowie, obviously, you know, the white supremacy and far right element is a major component of that in the country today. And so, you know, I would say that's the key direction through which we are trying to address that issue.
Awesome. Any other comments from anyone about that particular topic? Let's see. So I think what I want to do is just give a quick opportunity if anyone on the panel has anything that you wanted to mention or that you didn't, just very quickly to kind of wrap things up here. Zack, is there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, just a few partners that I would, and of course, anyone, after this event wraps, feel free to email me. I'm happy to share, any and all information on some of the partners that we work with on the funding side to try and combat these issues. But I just re-mentioned the ones that I just went through on the political violence side. Again, that's the Bridging Divides initiative at Princeton. They've got a great risk analysis map that for particularly community foundations that are trying to assess sort of what is my relative risk to the rest of the country. I would point you there. I would also point you to their Bridging Divides map, which maps over 7,000 different community, locally rooted organizations that are addressing any number of issues. It's a great way to kind of spot potential partners in your backyard. Again, we've already talked about ADL doing great work, as well as Project Over Zero. They've got a toolkit for folks that are trying to understand kind of how to build greater community resilience and greater social cohesion and sort of the different strategies to get at that. I'd recommend that toolkit to you for sure. And then just another group that comes to mind that's doing some really great work to try and bridge divides between individuals, but then share those stories is a group called StoryCorps. They're based out of New York, but their program, the One Small Step Initiative, is one that I'd encourage everyone to take a look at. It's a great way to see sort of the power of peaceful pluralism and bridging divides in action, and then see the impact that those stories then have on the broader public via their NPR partnership and their other media partnerships.
Thank you. Winter, anything you wanted to add?
I don't think so, Rowie. I'm, again, just happy to share, happy to bounce ideas if anybody needs that from the community foundation angle.
Awesome. Abbas?
I just wanted to actually echo Project Over Zero that Zack mentioned. It's wonderful to see that there are some really effective organizations out there working on these much more difficult problems. And I will just say that the problem of passing a policy and implementing a protocol is not as daunting as the work that Zack and some of the partners there are doing. But I also want to amplify some really courageous actors that I believe have done right in this space. And one of them is a partner and somebody we work with closely, and that's Innovia Foundation out of Eastern Washington. And I've just found them to be just great, good faith partners working on this issue in the right way and moving the needle on this, as well as I believe David mentioned, Dr. Eric Jolly out of St. Paul, Minnesota Community Foundation, Amalgamated Foundation. There's just really some great actors that have done wonderful work in this space that are supporting and investing in our work. Also, Democracy Fund has supported this work, and I just want to amplify and let folks know that I know that community foundations tend to be very siloed and place-based and rooted in their communities, obviously, but there are a plethora of resources out there to have the sector move forward in the right direction.
Wonderful. And Anna, last words to wrap us up?
Sure, yeah. I want to again thank everybody and just sort of echo the call to be bold and take action on this issue in this moment. I think it's critical. I think if nothing else, the work that the panelists have talked about today kind of underscores the opportunity and the ability to really move the dial on this issue. And I think the one other thing I would just say is I think it's really important in this space and in looking at the different definitions of hate, not to fall into false equivalencies. I think there's some really clear lines here that once you really look at what's happening and what organizations are doing, it's not that hard to be able to make decisions for yourself and your foundation based on your values.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think that wraps us up here. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And I think that we will release you to go back to the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Ari.
our panelists.
Everybody.